This panel is called Science and Ecology from Aquatic Organisms to Plants and Pollinators. Next up is James Nieh, who's a professor at the University of California, San Diego, Division of Biological Sciences, and he's a newly elected fellow of the Royal Entomological Society. The recent chair and the recent chair of the section of Ecology, Behavior, and Evolution, and he studies the evolution of communication in social bees and factors that influence honeybee health. Dr. Nieh will be also in the Supporting Biodiversity workshop where you can ask him questions later. Thank you. I have these things.
Thank you. This controls these slides, is that right?
Yeah.
I guess we do. All right, great. Well, welcome. Thank you for making it today. And I am more focused on bees, but I wanted to make this a little bit more general to explain why we should care about bees, particularly as humans. And I think that we have an enduring fascination as a species with bees. And I put up this slide. This is from a stele, an Egyptian stele from 660 BCE. And it presents an image of the good life, which in the afterlife consists of having a lot of food and living, if not in a land of milk and honey, certainly a lot of honey. These guys that look, I'm just going to use this pointer instead, like wasps are actually honeybees, and this is the traditional ancient Egyptian style of beehive. So from this, of course, we've now moved on to our modern understanding of the roles of bees. And in particular, what's interesting about honeybees is that they share many of the same characteristics with other insects that are important for our environment. So here is a slide showing 4 different kinds of bees. You may recognize the bumblebees. This is not a bee, so that was a trick question or trick statement. This is actually a fly. But flies are also important pollinators as well, so we should certainly not neglect them. These are bumblebees, and here's another bumblebee. And in fact, there are thousands of different species of native bees, and here in Southern California, at least in the area of San Diego, we actually are a biodiversity hotspot for solitary bees. So all of these guys, these insects, can equally be affected by insecticides. Now, honeybees are essential agricultural pollinators, and they're worth about $12 billion as calculated in 2009. But this study should probably be updated to reflect current trends. And here's some of the important crops: macadamia nuts, kiwis, passion fruit, cantaloupe, watermelon, pumpkin, and so on, that are exclusively bee pollinated. Most of these are honeybees, but in some cases there are other bees involved as well. And we know that pesticides play a very key role in agricultural production, so hence the exposure of bees. Now, this graph, which is courtesy of the USDA data, shows an interesting trend which has not been driven necessarily by recent disease or what's happened in the last decade with bees, which has led to a great deal of concern. But what you can see here is that from 1945, when data was first taken, there's been a steady decline in the number of colonies in the United States. And this has probably been driven largely by shifts in farming, moving from small family farms to the mass kind of agriculture we mainly see today. And one thing I wanted to point out, right down here, about 1.5 million, these are just the number of colonies needed to pollinate California almonds. So it really is reaching a point where we are at a point where maybe we won't have enough bees to pollinate all of our crops. Now, the big thing that I'm often asked about is colony collapse disorder, this idea that the bees are somehow missing. And they're probably not at a bar complaining to a barkeep, but instead, there are actually clear scientific causes to why this has occurred. But one of them I wanted to rule out is this idea that cell phone radiation is killing or misorienting our bees. There have been a few studies that have been published showing some effects, but in all of these studies, they essentially placed a cell phone transmitter, the transmitter, inside a beehive. Now, it's not exactly a realistic exposure, and if someone came to you and said, "Would you mind if we stuck this transmitter in your bedroom?" you'd probably say no. So there's no data showing that cell phone transmissions actually affect honeybees at realistic levels. But there are 5 different things that we know are important. And here are some of the 4 main ones. So here we have the parasite Varroa destructor, and this is like a giant mite. If you were the size of a bee, this would be the size of a dinner plate. And they transmit diseases as well as sucking the hemolymph, the blood, of young larval bees. We also have beekeeping practices. In the United States, we have one of the most industrialized forms of agriculture in the world, and part of this high yield depends upon having hundreds of thousands of bee colonies trucked around the United States. And this can create a problem because when these colonies are being unloaded, they're in a new location, they're disoriented, and bees can enter. So sick bees from one colony can enter a colony which is still relatively healthy. Pesticides, which of course is a major focus of my talk and the symposium, and then finally diseases, which can be vectored by the parasites and pathogens, but also by bees just moving back and forth and transmitting diseases to each other. Now, one thing I wanted to highlight here is how this works, this industry of moving bees. So you actually will see these semi-trailers loaded with millions of bees moving colonies around the United States, and you can see this general flow map of where these colonies are going. One of the things that I naively thought is, why don't we encourage local bees for local agriculture? But the problem is that once that particular crop, such as the almond crop, is no longer in bloom, what will the bees eat? There's no way that we can plant enough food that the bees will actually have an alternative. Remember, we have 1.5 million colonies that are seasonally going to this one spot in the Central Valley. So, therefore, because of this, we have these colonies that are moving around great distances around the United States, and essentially their whole life cycle is being on the move. We now know that pollution from diesel fumes and other sources can adversely affect their lives. And I mentioned giving diseases to each other. So imagine that you're a colony, you've been trucked around. When they're doing that, they don't like to use the restroom facilities. They just stay inside the nest. And so any diseases they have, particularly of the gut, can start to fester. But once they arrive and they're still, they start swarming out, they begin defecating outside, and they're also a bit confused. So you can see this is exactly where one colony can start to infect another colony. Now, Varroa destructor, I mentioned, this is the guy that is actually responsible for the majority of winter colony losses, and it vectors diseases. And here you can see the bee, and these are the Varroa. This is the adult stage, and the Varroa, the males and the females, will go inside the cells, and they will infect the larvae. Now, one interesting thing is that Varroa is extremely clever and is constantly becoming resistant to the different treatments that we provide our bees. So now there are uses of formic acid, of thymol, oxalic acid, and unfortunately, one of the most effective treatments, which is a chemical known as fluvalinate, against killing the mites. But beekeepers are constantly trying to figure out a way to beat the mites. But this is an evolutionary arms race where whatever we try to give them, they are able to evolve a resistance to. And unfortunately, you might guess that these products are also ending up in our food supply, in the honey that we consume, in the pollen that we may consume for bees, and also in the wax products. Okay, so of course, my presentation here is focused on pesticides and xenobiotics. And I wanted to first give you a definition. A xenobiotic is basically an artificial man-made chemical. They include insecticides, herbicides, many of the different chemicals that the previous speakers have talked about. A key thing here is that pesticides kill insect pests. However, bees are insects, and pesticides can't really tell the difference. So, how does this work? As Dr. Hadlick just mentioned, we have these seed treatments, and how exactly does this work? So you have this chemical, like a neonicotinoid, you plant a seed inside it, or you place a seed inside it, coating the seed with the chemical. This is then planted in the ground, and up springs, for example, sunflower, which is not actually glowing red, but every cell of that sunflower's body is essentially containing this amount of insecticide. Now, you might say, well, it's got a very small amount. Right now, it's diluted. But the key thing is it's so potent at nanogram levels that this is efficacious. And when all of these different pest insects come and try to attack it, they will die. But the problem is that we have pollinators that may also come. And they can be exposed thereby from the pollen, from the nectar, and even from the guttation droplets, which is like a little bit like sap coming from the plants. So Michelle showed you this slide previously. This is imidacloprid, and here's an animation showing, you can see from 1994 up to 2009, where it's being used and how it's spread. And again, just to reiterate on what she showed earlier, you can see that imidacloprid and many other neonicotinoids are used in a wide variety of the crops that we consume. And it's not just in these crops, but in fact, it's all around us. And in many cases, it's mandated by law. So any of you who have orange trees, or if there's public areas in which orange trees are growing, they're affected by this disease called HLB. The oranges turn yellow, which means they're not saleable. But they're perfectly fine oranges, but no one wants to buy a yellow orange. And it's vectored by, it's a disease that's vectored by this insect, which is a plant-sucking insect. So therefore, at various times, the government has mandated the treatment largely with neonicotinoids. So for example, this is the Asian citrus psyllid program, and all of these areas shown in these dots were required by law to have this treatment of the neonicotinoids. And of course, as you know, these are in the home and around us as well. So they're used in our garden, they're being used on our pets. And as Michelle just mentioned, exposure through water is important because not many people realize that honeybees, like any other animal, need water. And what they actually prefer is dirty water because they not only need water, they need something which is deficient in nectar and pollen, and that is salt. So they like to go to mud, newly irrigated soil, and collect the salt in the water, and these are just example images, but in fact, they can thereby be exposed to very large amounts of pesticide. So there has been growing resistance to neonicotinoids, and I like this slide because, in fact, the resistance to this by insects has been increasing over time. So as we use more and more of it, the insects are becoming more resistant. However, it's also true that people are expressing some resistance as well. And the movement to save the bees has actually had a major effect. You've probably heard about the banning in the European Union and new studies that are constantly coming out as well. So the research that we do is now largely focused on the new neonicotinoid. This has been developed by Bayer Corporation. It's called Savanto. And the most interesting thing is it's advertised and EPA approved as having no adverse effects on honeybees and bumblebees. However, all of the studies, which is following normal EPA procedure, were commissioned by Bayer Corporation. And so we wanted to provide some independent research looking at this. Fluopyridiferone, because it's considered to be bee safe, and because it is not a neonicotinoid, does not have any of the restrictions in the EU, so it circumvents all of these things. And it's used in multiple crops, as you can see here. And if you come to my talk later this afternoon, I'll talk more about the crops and exactly what it's being used for, and how in our lab we use different experiments to study the effects of these new pesticides. But I'll just mention that, in fact, it turns out not to be that bee safe. And so it's an interesting issue. And moreover, it's suspicious that it is somehow considered to be bee safe when, in fact, it affects the same neural target as the neonicotinoids, the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. Oh, okay, let's see. I think, well, we're going to skip that in the interest of time. So I'll just show you a brief snapshot of it. And here you can see that we have a bee mounted onto this carousel, and she is flying around. And in a moment, you're going to see a slow motion video of this. It's actually magnetically levitated to reduce friction, and it's attached to a Teflon rod. So what we're doing is the bees are not being moved around. They're flying by their own power. And by this, we can actually measure how rapidly and how far the bees are flying. Normally in this setup, a single bee can fly about 2 kilometers, and they can do this for hours. But when they're exposed to pesticides, there are detrimental changes. Now, you may have mentioned, or you may have recalled that I said that there were 5 major factors that affected bees. This is the 5th factor, and that is nutrition. Like us, bees need a well-balanced diet, but increasingly, they're exposed to a monoculture, they're not getting diverse food, and we recently published a study showing that pesticide exposure and reduced food intake, nutritional stress, reduce survival synergistically. So you combine the both of them, they're much worse. So I think the solutions are to reduce and use only when necessary, integrated pest management practices, organic approaches, encouraging bee health and diversity, planting native plants, encouraging the growth of agricultural hedgerows. And to learn more, I would suggest, if you can, to attend the effective pesticides later on this afternoon. And then if you're interested more in the work that I do, you can just Google Nieh Lab UCSD, and everything that we have, including all of our publications and our outreach efforts, are there for you to see. So, this is a picture of the website. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next speaker is Scott Carroll, who is at the Institute for Contemporary Evolution and at UC Davis. Dr. Carroll will also be speaking in the Supporting Biodiversity workshop this afternoon. He is twice a Fulbright scholar. He combines academic and solutions-oriented work as the founding director for the Institute for Contemporary Evolution at the Department of Entomology at the University of Davis. He investigates patterns of ongoing evolution in wild and human-influenced environments around the world in support of sustainable interdisciplinary solutions to challenges in food production, healthcare, and environmental conservation.
Thank you, Terry. Good morning, everybody. It's a real opportunity and pleasure for me to be here and to speak between such an august and activated group of people who are concerned about the future of their friends, family, communities, now and henceforth. And I'm an evolutionary biologist by training, and James provided me with a very nice foundation for speaking further about escalation of arms races between society and other species adapting to our control measures, and potential means using evolutionary thinking to find ways out of those traps. So work I do, in addition to basic evolutionary biology, is also with insects and plants in wild systems. And further, I also direct a private laboratory that supports the development of principally botanical insect repellents for public health use. And in that capacity, a lot of my work brings me into direct engagement with the US EPA and pesticide registrations, because insect repellents for human use are regulated as insecticides by US EPA in the United States. The work I'm talking about today relates to taking more conciliatory approaches to other species that we may categorize as antagonistic to our interests or as adversaries. And by conciliatory approach, I really mean a way to address the Achilles heel of eradication approach, because attempts at eradication tend to sow the seeds of their own failure. The stronger we select on species to reduce their population levels, the more strongly we favor individuals that can biochemically or behaviorally or whatever way, members of those target populations that can evade our control measures. And this Achilles heel in some ways can perhaps be also thought of as an Achilles mouth of the human species, because so much of what we do on a daily basis, whether it's popping an antibiotic pill, which would be less common, maybe not daily, but really in every bite of food we take, we are influencing the ecological and evolutionary fates of the other species around us, including the charismatic megafauna sometimes on other continents that Michelle was showing pictures of in her talk. So even though I may work with insects, I think they're very cute, but a lot of what we do each day influences Bengal tigers and pandas and orangutans and other things that are too cute to ignore. In this work, I'm just pressing buttons till something happens, bear with me. Can I press this middle one? Oh, there's one. I worked with the colleagueship of Peter Jorgensen. He is a researcher at the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences, also at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And beginning in 2016, we organized a working group at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. It's an NSF-funded synthesis center at the University of Maryland. It's based in Annapolis. And the title of our pursuit, which is an international group of workers working in public health and in agriculture, is called Living with Resistance. And you'll see how that pertains. So a lot of us might tend to perceive us in a biosphere of paradise lost, where a lot of the inherent aspects of the environment that may signal health, security, maybe settle there, raise a family, have now been reduced to a more desolate and depauperate environment where the very features of life itself seem to be draining away, including not just biological clocks, but the clocks of evolutionary change and adaptation. And perhaps that has some merit, certainly from the perspectives of certain species. What I show here is a heuristic, which is an adaptive landscape. And so it looks like a mountain range. And if you have a population of organisms, a group of individuals which each have somewhat different genes, so each of us might be mapped along the floor of this range because of our gene combinations, but across generations, certain genes might persist better in this room or in a population in a given environment that perform better in terms of survival and reproduction. So some gene combinations out of the original set will be more favored than others, and populations can become more specialized. Not that you might not have different types. It could be different color morphs or different genders, et cetera, that flourish depending on, relatively speaking, depending on the situation. However, in these latter days, to borrow a term that's been used in similar apocalyptic promulgations, we have a situation where there are perhaps fewer and lower fitness peaks for many organisms than there were for prior generations. Smaller populations mean fewer genes available for adaptation to changing circumstances. How a particular gene influences development, what you grew up to be, may be different in these newer environments, changed environments, than would have been the case in prior environments. So altered mapping to fitness is one way to summarize that notion, leading to organisms, whether juvenile or adult, that are now relatively mismatched to their environment. So what we're looking at is the dichotomy between adaptation to change versus mismatch to change. Things with short generation times, rapid development, et cetera, as populations are more able usually to adapt to change genetically than things that are longer developing, longer generation times. And so many of the populations we care about may suddenly find themselves not at an adaptive peak any longer, but near the base of it, having to find ways across generations to fly uphill, so to speak, or that the entire peak has now shifted down near the valley floor of extinction, that they're, even with adaptation, you can't fly as high as you might have before. But I would emphasize that living things are not simply standing by idly while we alter their planet. We've been seeing lots of examples of insecticide resistance evolution. So here's this graph going up across the last century since resistance was first reported. Number of species, number of records, independent records of the evolution, number of different insecticidal compounds. This is now well above 15,000. These data are through about 2013. So it's not only continuing to evolve, but we have more and more records being reported. This is a pink cotton bollworm, which will feature a little later in things I discuss in the biodiversity, supportive biodiversity workshop. But it's not just hard selection from chemicals that cause this Achilles heel to manifest. Here is a seedling rice plant. Here is a seedling barnyard grass plant that grows in association with rice cultivation. Here is a seedling barnyard rice grass that does not grow in association with rice cultivation. And so what we have here is mimicry from the standpoint of hand cultivation, hand weeding of rice fields. So even if you're a really active bush regenerator, as they're called in Australia, where you're out there in the community on weekends taking out non-native plants with your community, restoring natives, you are selecting for the means of your failure ultimately. And life finds a way. And it doesn't necessarily mind the categories that we would prefer to stay in or to put it in. Similar things, birds are evolving, not birds, but birds are, in addition to these bugs, birds are evolving new migratory pathways. Insects are evolving to feed on introduced invasive plants, particularly in cases where the plants become so abundant that they represent new real resources, and the insects can overcome initial maladaptation. Lizards evolving new digestive organs, entirely new when transplanted to novel islands, and anticoagulant rodenticide adaptation in rodents. In addition, adaptation to urban environments and to behavioral changes, morphological changes, to living in new places. And then superweeds. Superweeds, it's almost a misnomer in the sense that really this giant ragweed doesn't necessarily know it's been treated with herbicides at all, because it doesn't respond to them, and now it's just reaping the benefits of modern agriculture in terms of a lot of nutrition. These are the corn plants down below the crop field. This is the giant ragweed. This is the giant machine, and it is comical, and we all know that it's tragic as well. So just to walk through the evolutionary conundrum we find ourselves in, using the example of pesticides, and I'll comment a bit more on antibiotics just as appropriate later. But here we have biocide use, which has increased, particularly since the middle. And you don't have to see all these little details, but to the extent you can, antibiotics, herbicides, insecticides, pesticides, since the middle of the 20th century, up. And when new classes of biocides, by biocides I mean pesticides, antimicrobials, et cetera, are introduced, they're discovered, and resistance quickly follows. It's a great thing about evolutionary biology. You can predict the future. And it's an untapped power, it really is. But may the force be with all of us. So resistance spreads to all modes of action and across all species. So this is the reality we are embedded in. It's thoroughgoingly evolutionary. It's not just about dinosaurs anymore. It's about what's happening in response to what's on our forks. The geographic spread of resistance has led to acceleration of cases and multiple resistance. That is, the true super weeds, et cetera, with resistance to multiple modes of action within single genotypes is growing rapidly as well. So facilitating factors for this are the homogenization of cropping, where we have, for example, genetically modified crops, whether they're intended to permit more herbicide use or to reduce insecticide use. So glyphosate versus Bacillus thuringiensis crops. By occupying vast proportions, hundreds of millions of acres, up to 30% or more of planted areas for major crops, the homogenization makes selection constant and continuous over vast areas, potentiating evolutionary response and resistance. And then international trade and travel, spreading resistant organisms, spreading resistance genes. So we find ourselves at a crossroads here, and we're depicting this as an option. This is approximately the present. And where do we go? Towards something that might be called planetary health, or do we continue with our war on pests, which we have perennially been losing? The lessons are clear, but we're entrained in this mechanism of increasing escalation, where we use a strong chemical, it works for a while, we become dependent on it. various social levers, societal levers, make us more entrained and less flexible than we would otherwise be. How do we break out of that? Well, we don't break out of it. We apply more pesticides, more chemicals. We select more strongly. Our option space becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. But are there modes out of this pattern? So lime sulfur, also called sulfur lime, was introduced in 1885 in orchard crops in California by the early 1900s. That was the first report of resistance. Going forward, penicillin 1928, so switched from food to health. By the 1940s, it was already showing, there was already resistance to it in hospitalized populations before it was released to the public in general. Back to crops, maybe GM crops here, food, a little blip in efficacy with the incorporated pesticides like the BT. This doesn't refer to glyphosate, obviously. But back to health, 2016, 214,000 sepsis deaths, bacterial deaths in infants. At the same time, the UN held the first ever high-level meeting, that is heads of states, on an evolutionary topic. So evolutionary applications are the highest profile consideration in history in 2016 about antibiotics. We also know glyphosate resistance is rampant. So where to go? A lot of the solutions to breaking out of this escalatory pathway and moving toward an de-escalatory pathway involve practices that are the same as those of meeting sustainable development goals and resilient principles. And so I've listed conciliation for sustainability, that is not selecting for our own failure, learning more about pests and microbes and how they work and interact both ecologically and evolutionarily within modern systems, reducing inappropriate use, so preventative medicine, IPM rather than integrated pesticide management, integrated, I can't remember what it stands for now, it's too late. Pest management, that's right. And so reducing inappropriate use, polyculture, crop rotation, things that have been used for millennia that we do have the capacity to reincorporate in systems where we now have populations that are dependent on these strong chemicals. And so that transition is what's going to be really critical. And in the workshop today, I'll speak to community-based efforts at continental scales to cooperate, where individuals bear the cost of shifting to long-term perspectives from the shorter-term perspectives of, yes, doctor, give me a pill, or no, I'm not going to do IPM because my bottom line will improve this year if I don't. So those risky behaviors can be curtailed through committed community cooperation, and I'll be speaking about cultivating that. Thank you very much.
So don't forget to follow up in the workshops with these speakers. Thank you.